Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about moving from the classical Greeks into the classical Roman period of rhetoric. So hopefully you got everything that you needed about Aristotle from his work. And just as a reminder, the main points from that are that we know the different types or genres of rhetoric, that we understand what an enthymeme is, that it comes from the idea of the syllogism, that the syllogism comes from inductive and deductive reasoning, and inductive and deductive reasoning come from the proofs, the inartificial and inartistic proofs that we need to reason as human beings for the purpose and practice of rhetoric. Thus, philosophy linking rhetoric and science. So really, Aristotle is saying that you cannot have rhetoric without dialectic, and you cannot have dialectic without rhetoric, and that dialectic is where we do our reasoning for the most part. We are looking at that point of stasis between two equally oppositional points. The wall behind me is yellow, the wall behind me is gold, both equally valid arguments, but we could debate it if we really wanted to get into that, right? It's possible to debate a question of fact. There is a wall there. We could debate that. That is, I know that sounds crazy, but that's because there's really three kinds of argument. We have questions of fact, questions of policy, questions of quality or value. And these actually don't get outlined by Aristotle at all. Although you'll find that Cicero and Quintilian, when they're commenting on Aristotle's rhetoric and on the genres, they are really commenting on those three as well, particularly with Quintilian, which we'll get to a little bit later. But we really need to understand that from Aristotle comes all of the rest. The three parts of an argument: a claim, data, warrant, which you might have heard in Com 115, or your basic communication courses or argumentation classes. All of that comes from the idea of the syllogism, deductive reasoning, the idea that we would be able to make a claim based on our civil discourse and our civil understanding of the world and our civil agreements, which later on John Locke would call the social contract. Aristotle says that there's a civil agreement, right? That there's civil action that we can take. And oftentimes when we think civil, we are equating that with the practice of civility. And really what Aristotle was referring to was this, what we refer to now as civics, the idea of participating in that public discourse with civility. For Aristotle, those two could not be separated. And so we too probably should not separate them. That when we are engaging in a civic action, we are doing it civilly, because the civic action is specifically for others in our community, right? It's not for us, it's for others. And when that's the case, then we should be behaving civilly. That's probably a lot that I just gave you to sum up Aristotle. And really what's important is, like I said, the two types of argument, the two types of reasoning, three genres of argument, two types of reasoning, the most common form of argument, which of course is the enthymeme, what an enthymeme is. Those are the kinds of things that I need you to get out of Aristotle, because those are the main trends and ideas that we're going to be talking about with our future rhetoricians, all the way up, theorists, all the way up to our current times. Why? Because all of those have a relationship with the truth, or what we perceive to be the truth. And that's what becomes important. And in fact, Quintilian will actually start separating that out for us, which is hard for people to get their minds around, that there would be a time prior to really the modern period when we actually separated the idea of a material truth from, say, a philosophical one. But if you consider that Aristotle talks about the topoi, the topics, he talks about values, he talks about policy, he talks about claims of fact that are in fact debatable. In fact, I need to say that one more time. So how do we tell the difference between those three? It's pretty simple. I think you know this already. A question of fact, something did or did not happen. I can prove it true or false. Now, just because I can't prove it true and false does not make it not a question of fact. And just because I can prove it false doesn't mean it's not fact. Here's what I mean by that. If I were to say to you, the Holocaust never happened, a majority of the world, I think it's still a majority, does not believe that's true. They believe 100% that there was, in fact, the Holocaust during World War II, and that many, many people lost their lives, way too many. That Hitler was in charge and that he did these horrible atrocities. But there are some, and it's bigger than you'd think, in the world who would say, no, that's not true. So if it's not true, does that make it a question of fact? Does it make it a factual statement? Absolutely. It just doesn't make it a true one. So, well, not my opinion, at least, I guess, at this point. So, for example, if I say to you, there are 2 candles on my wall behind me, and you say, no, there's not, and I say, yes, there is, and I say, look, you can count them 1, 2, right? There's actually 4, but you can't see the other ones. 1, 2, 2. There are 2 candles. I can show that to you. I can demonstrate it to you. It's an inartistic proof. It does not require any human interpretation beyond understanding what the meaning of the words coming out of my mouth are. That's it. So we don't need to debate that so much. But we could, if we wanted to, either because somebody's withholding information, or because somebody does not want to acknowledge something, or because I interpret it differently. I suppose if there are people in the world who think that killing a bunch of people is okay, that's a question of quality, right? That's a moral judgment. That's not a question of fact. So it becomes a different kind of debate, which leads us to questions of value. The questions of value, of course, are the quality of anything. So anytime I put a qualification on something, the color of my walls is pretty. No, it's not. I definitely could debate that. Ugh. Okay. Why don't I paint them? I'll get there eventually. I've only done like 5 of my 9 rooms. I'll get here eventually. The candles on my wall are crooked. That's putting a quality on those candles, which is in fact true, by the way. They are in fact crooked at the moment. You may be able to tell that, you may not, because you're not in the room like I am, you're out there. So then we say, well, who's the more trustworthy, more credible source of information here for this question of quality? And the answer would be me. I'm in the room. The question would be you're second because you're looking at the room. And third would be somebody who's just taken a wild guess, right? So your level of credibility has to do with your level of 2 things. Your character, the fact that you're believable, but also your knowledge of the subject, right? So when Aristotle's talking about that, when he's talking about ethos specifically, he's talking about credibility made up of character and competence. If you're a good person, I don't think that matters on this debate very much. Do I know what I'm talking about? Well, I'm in the room with the candles, so we would assume. These are actually very simple concepts if you think about them. Add into that you need 3 things in order to be able to persuade someone of an argument, and you're done. Aristotle says those 3 things, of course, are the artistic and the artificial proofs: ethos, pathos, and logos. Easily done. Artificial proofs differ from inartificial proofs in that artificial proofs require human interpretation and explanation. That's pretty much it. But why is that important? Why was that even a discussion? Because Plato said there's no way for human beings to interpret a truth. That the only way we get there is dialectic. And Aristotle said that's great. That's great that we engage in this dialectic, that we get to this point of stasis, but then a decision has to be made. It's only likely that those candles are crooked. If we want to debate whether or not they're pretty or not, that would be a different question. But there's only a likelihood that these things are true, because while there's not a likelihood that there's 2 candles, that's assured, right? That we know to be true because it's inartificial, it's inartistic. Whether they're crooked or whether they're pretty are questions of quality. So that relies heavily on the experience or the competence of the speaker. Finally, you have the questions of policy, where all of the credibility and the use of the 3 artificial proofs along with inartificial proofs which is always required, according to Aristotle, except in the case of an inartificial question, one that can be proven through the five senses. With the exception of that, you always need ethos, pathos, and logos, and you always need those to be based in, around, beside, however you want to think about it, inartificial proofs. That is to say, data, or what some people call facts, scientific facts. Now, really here, Aristotle's talking about science as well, okay? So what we want to do is not determine the difference between science and rhetoric, because we will find that science is a rhetoric, or rhetoric is a science, in some sorts of ways, okay? So we will discuss that as we get further into the more modern theorists. But for right now, those things from Aristotle and his definition of rhetoric are the most important things you can get out of there. There's a 200-year jump between Aristotle and Cicero, who is really our next theorist. For those of you in the graduate class, I may have you reading a different piece in here, so I'll get to that at a separate date. For those of us in the undergraduate class, we just skip right to Cicero. I don't even think I have you read Longinus. I skip past that. Longinus, we're not sure when he really was placed as far as the history of rhetoric and writing. And is he really writing about rhetoric? Well, he's talking about utilizing rhetoric for the purpose of making things more sublime. That is to say, more pleasant, right? If any of you watch Supernatural, you watch Dean sublimate all the time. He can't handle the pain of the reality that he lives in, so what does he do? He hits things, he drinks a lot, and he has sex with women. That's called sublimation. Now, obviously, Longinus was not talking about that so much as he was just talking about how we work with the sublime, the idea of sublimating a subject matter in order to make it palatable to our audiences. And Aristotle is really the first to talk about the role of the audience in rhetoric, but he doesn't focus on it as much as some others will. So who's keeping rhetoric alive at this point? I mean, first of all, we're jumping countries here, and we're jumping from Greece to Italy, well, what is now modern-day Italy. So what is it that went on between those two things? And the answer is very simple: sophists. Sophists were always necessary. My book literally just fell on my foot and it hurt really, really badly. It's a heavy book. Rome, during that time, the sophists really had a job between Greece, the fall of Greece, and the start of Rome, or the, I should say, the empowerment of Rome. It's not like it didn't exist and it just popped up in 100 BCE. But instead, the practice of rhetoric moved to a place where it was necessary. It's not necessary in certain governmental organizations or social organizations, right? You only need rhetoric if you have a public that needs to understand its government and participate in it. If we didn't have a participatory democracy, we would not need to understand rhetoric. That's pretty much what Aristotle says. And I tend to agree with him. The truth of the matter is that the more dictatorial or authoritarian your government is, that is to say, the more centralized the power is around one person or very few people, the less need there is for rhetoric. In fact, the less you want your people to understand rhetoric. For if they understand rhetoric, I'm trying to straighten this, if they understand rhetoric, there could be a power uprising. They could fight against you. Yeah, that'd be terrible, wouldn't it? So when people say, oh, well, Hitler was a great rhetorician, I say, nay, he was not. He did not get power over the people merely by being persuasive. Unless we want to call guns at your head persuasive, which of course we don't. We call that coercion. So he needed rhetoric in order to sort of move up in the ranks of the Nazi government, but he did not need rhetoric once he was in power, because his people were kept in power, or kept him in power, not by choice. Okay, this was not a democracy. So there was no need to really worry about it And you certainly didn't want them having that power. What's the first thing that was done during the Arab Spring? It's probably, actually, you guys are probably pretty young. It feels like it was yesterday to me, but it was probably like 10 years ago now. The Arab Spring, of course, was when a lot of countries, a lot of people, citizens in countries that were authoritarian mainly, started to think about the possibility of a democracy, the idea that they could have a democratic or representative system, that they could participate in their government. They wanted to start demanding that. What's the first thing the governments did? They cut off their internet. They cut off their ability to communicate with each other. Why? Because when your people can communicate with each other, they could share education. That education can be utilized to usurp power. And that's problematic for authoritarian regimes. So the more centralized a power, the less need there is for rhetoric. The more decentralized a power, let's say in a democratic republic like ours, the greater the need for rhetoric. The more you have to persuade me to vote for you, the more you have to persuade us to do something that the government wants us to do, or that we want our government to do for us. Now, when people talk right now about our democracy being on the brink, probably. Now, if this was a political class, we would go into that a little bit more. If you want to talk about the political philosophy behind that statement, we certainly can, because if you jump to Quintilian and you go to chapter 12, the first line of chapter 12 in your book, remember that's an edited and, in fact, a translated version, obviously, of Quintilian's work. If you go to De Orate, and you look at chapter 12, which would be XII, for those of you not into the Roman numerals, you look at the first sentence, that will give you a really good clue as to how rhetoric and democracies are linked to each other. More importantly, how rhetoric and power are linked to each other. So during the ancient Greek period of time, we have this debate between philosophy and truth, and therefore the role of rhetoric and truth. So during the Roman time, we move to a different question, which is the relationship of power and rhetoric. So the sophists were going around helping people sort of settle land disputes from wars, or the incredible story of Corax and Tisius. Some of you may have heard this story before. The story goes that Corax was the teacher of Tisius. Tisius was his student. And Corax was a sophist, so he was teaching Tisius rhetoric, supposedly. And Tisius decided he didn't want to pay Corax. So Corax and Tisius went to court to settle this dispute that they were having. And Corax says, listen, you have to make him pay me. I did my job. I did it really well. I taught him exactly what he needed to know. And if you don't believe me, if you think he's made a better argument than me, then that proves I did my job, and therefore you would still award me the money. And Tisius said, whoa, wait. That's not how this works. You did not give me all the tools I need in order to be a successful rhetor. And you did not teach me all the parts of it, because sophists don't teach all the parts of it, as I'm supposed to know. And if you don't believe me, Your Honor, that's because he didn't teach me well enough to beat him in court, and therefore I win. That is the ultimate point of stasis. There's no answer there. Very rarely will we see that occur. In fact, that is probably the only time that something like that would come up. And in fact, it didn't. It's a story. It's a tale to show and demonstrate what stasis is, to show and demonstrate the power of rhetoric, and also how it could be utilized and therefore abused in some ways. So does that make rhetoric inherently bad? Or do people just use a really good tool in a bad way? Same question about guns, I guess, or certain medications or whatever. We could compare it to a lot of things that seem to be inherently good or bad, but are merely tools for us to decide how we use them. That become a question of value. So during this brief time, I say brief, 200 years, It's sort of funny to think about this, but my brother, who is 2 years younger than I am, he was born in 1976. And so the country turned 200 years old in 1976. And I still think of the country as 200 years old. It's actually 220, 250. We're on getting to 250 now. And so if we're 250 years old, and we're really talking about a stretch between the ancient Greeks and the ancient Roman studies, only about 200 years, then really it's not that long. Our nation is not that old. I'm sorry, I'm shaking the camera. It's incredibly young, in fact. Okay, so we are the longest running democratic republic ever, but considering there's only ever been one other, and hey, segue, it's in Rome during about 100 BCE. It's hard to say we're the longest surviving one, and therefore it should fall, because all republics eventually fall. That can't be true, because there's only ever been one other republic. Well, I guess that's true. The only other republic that has truly existed in the world failed in under 200 years. So really under 100. So, maybe that's a good reason for us to just lay down and no longer be a republic. I got into an argument with a friend of mine about this recently. And I say a friend, he's somebody I met when I was in New York for the high school national forensics competition. His father wrote for Time magazine. Now he's a freelance writer. And James in of himself is fairly famous, but in Australia, don't ask me. Anyway, he and I get into debates all the time. He was raised on Fifth Avenue in the 80s. I mean, we're talking money, 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 and just, Reaganomics. And I was raised in a Kennedy household, definitely a Democrat, blue-collar family. And so we have very differing opinions about the world, and we still do. But we argue with each other all the time, and we call each other our favorite sparring partners, mainly because even though I disagree with him, I recognize that he's intelligent, he's making good arguments. He does the same thing for me. But are we going to ever agree? No. Does that make one of us terrible and one of us good? No. It just makes us debaters, I think, at that point, right? Because ultimately, we don't get to decide what happens with our democracy. The people get to decide. And that's what Rome and the Roman Republic were all about. Thus, enter Cicero. Cicero's considered the greatest orator of all time. By whom? Quintilian. I'm sorry, I find that funny, because the Quintilian comes up very, very quickly. And I'm not really sure that that he's wrong necessarily. I mean, Cicero had some great speeches, some great orations that, if you read them, are pretty moving even today. But more importantly, he wrote what we now call the handbook, or we call it the student handbook, the textbook, if you will, for oratory. So Cicero writes this basically instruction manual. Here is how to be a good rhetorician. Here's how to practice oratory. Here's how to understand it. He did not necessarily invent a whole lot that was new, with the exception of one small thing. And I'll get to that in a second. But what he did do was take everything that Aristotle did, and he organized it for us. And he organized it into 5 categories, if you will, or 5 canons is a better word. Canons, rules, the basic rules that we follow. And he put them in order. So I believe that your book and I agree on the order. It's possible that the last 2 might be flipped. It depends on who you talk to as far as theorists are concerned. Those 5 are pretty well known. I'm kind of pausing as if you're going to tell me what they are. You won't. Inventio, invention. And then we have dispositio, which of course is arrangement. That's not just organization, it's arrangement. It's understanding how the argument should be put together for the audience to follow it. And then we have style, and then memory, and then delivery. And sometimes people reverse, I said the last two, I was wrong. Sometimes people reverse style and memory, but I put style third. And so did Cicero. Cicero said that style is what makes rhetoric important, that all of the science and all of the law has to come to rhetoric in order for it to get the style that it needs to be conveyed to audiences in the appropriate manner. And here he's talking about education of the citizenry as well as the education of students, okay, at that time. He goes so in depth that he talks about what color toga you should wear. At one point, I don't think it's in your book. They used to put it in the book, but they don't anymore. It was just kind of humorous. He talked about when to strip off your toga in order to get attention if you're having trouble in a speech, which that's kind of cool. I find that kind of funny, kind of modern for Cicero, really, if you think about it. So what we really end up with is a treatise on how a student can become a great orator like Cicero. And so during the Republic, we could empower people, students, to do exactly that, to learn how to become public speakers. And that was not a problem. Cicero, aside from just talking about style and adding that in a little bit more than Aristotle does, who just sort of seems to mix it into delivery, Cicero also talks about 3 different levels of style. We have the common style, we have the middle style, and the grand style. And when we say grand, we're talking about big hand gestures. We're talking about, think about like your televangelists. The common is not street talk. The common is still formal speaking. All right, it's still formal speech making. It still follows the rules. It's still a presentation, but it is in the conversational language, the grammar of the people who you are speaking to. If you speak above people's heads with words that they don't understand, you're not going to teach them anything. They're not going to learn. They're not going to listen, right? So Cicero was really, really intent on everybody knowing exactly what their audience needed to hear in order to get the message or the argument that you were attempting to get across to that particular audience. So Cicero's handbook is for students. Now, some people would argue that Cicero died, or the day that Cicero died was the day that rhetoric died and the day that the Republic died. I don't think anybody pinpoints it quite like that, but there's some historians who would probably definitely agree with that. Now, why? Well, you know, Cicero taught people how to speak. I think it's Cicero who talks about 3 types of narratives, but it might be Quintilian, so I'm going to hold that off for my Quintilian lecture. But for Cicero, he really wanted people to be able to utilize rhetoric to move through the classes, to become more powerful, to understand what was going on in their everyday lives and who was making the rules, and he wanted to empower them. There's obviously some people during the Roman times that did not appreciate this very much. You could probably think of their names already. Caligula, Caesar, any of them. You have a move in Rome towards a more authoritarian or centralized power. There were 4 people who came together. Cicero was one of them. I believe the other 3 were Caesar, Antony, and I can't remember. It's not really all that important, I'll be honest with you. But they came together and they said to Cicero, we want to have a power of just the 4 of us, you know, the most powerful senators, just we will rule. And Cicero was like, no, I don't want to do that. I mean, I want the people to be represented. I want the citizens to be citizens. I'm not doing that. And, you know, there's some stories, like the soap opera version of this involves Cleopatra and her demanding Cicero's head on a plate because she saw what a threat he was to the Romans. And she, of course, was literally in bed with the Romans. There's some less fun versions of it, which are probably more historically accurate, which basically say at that point Cicero said, no, I'm not going to let the Republic die. And they said, fine, we'll kill it. And so they killed him. They cut out his tongue. They cut off his hands. They nailed his tongue and his hands to, I don't know if it was the gates of the city or the gates over the doorway to the Senate. I think it was the doorway to the Senate in the story. And they put his head on a pike. I believe all of those things are historically accurate, if not, most of them are. Why? Why his hands? Why his tongue? Because what are the tools for rhetoric? I mean, aside from, taking your ideas, you can't really steal those, but you could steal somebody's tongue and you could steal their hands, because that's where they believed that Cicero's power really lay. At that point, Rome goes to a triumvirate ruling, which of course are those other three. And there's some battling and some backstabbing at Tu Brute, and we end up with an empire. Okay. And so, actually the empire came a little bit before the Et Tu Brute, but it worked at the moment. It was comedic timing, I think. No? Okay. It's hard working without an audience. All right, so we end up moving into the time of the Roman Empire, and it's about 100 years between, about 200 years between Cicero and Quintilian. Maybe not quite that much, but Cicero died, I think most people say like 50, 53 BCE. And then Quintilian doesn't come along really until 100 CE. So there's a great deal of time, and Quintilian starts to write about rhetoric, and he starts to write about Cicero, and he knows what happened to Cicero. So guess what? When you write in a republic versus writing in an empire, you're going to write very differently, and you're going to make sure that you don't end up with the same fate as Cicero. So when we talk about Quintilian, we're going to talk specifically about that. As I told you, the Romans are really about the relationship between power and rhetoric. And so we'll get to Quintilian next time. I'll talk to you all then.